This is very important to understand, because shift in perception, it's also moved by energy. Every thought is energy, isn't it? Every thought, every feeling is energy. But on every shift in consciousness, there is corresponding change in matter. So every change in consciousness on the level of the individual, there is a corresponding shift in physiology. So back to the theme, to the main theme of the seeing from the heart. Those of you who are familiar with, let's say, Sufi tradition, this is, like loose translation into English language. The seeing from the heart, which is known as the most direct and immediate perception of whatever is being perceived. As I was speaking about this theme of perception, that is that what is basically gives us the idea of who we are, of where we are, because perception positions us in every term, internally and externally. You cannot walk around, you cannot walk, right, if you don't have the perception of space. This is very, very important. Like for instance, this a simple awareness of the space when you walk, gives you an idea. Otherwise, you will walk into a tree, right? Ride a bicycle. Many people ride a lot of people cycle in Amsterdam, and actually cycling is a very good example, because your awareness of space becomes very acute. Because you have to be aware of a lot of things simultaneously, and yet it's a very natural affair to cycle, isn't it? Like you don't think twice how to pedal. It's even less, it's even more natural than driving a car, in my view, in my experience. So it's like that's why you can cycle, and a lot is happening around, and yet your awareness is very, very acute. A good example of how perception and motion. Awareness of the space, of what is happening, so that you can, at the same time, enjoyment of being outside, you perceive everything, you perceive the ambience, atmosphere, sounds. Different faculties are engaged, and yet it's seamless, isn't it? That it's all seamless. And that's the beauty of perception, because it's seamless. There's nothing like, okay, now I'm going to smell, right? And now I cannot see when I smell, like kind of. If we are not embedded at birth, because some people come into this world with one sense, let's say, embedded. We're not talking about these cases, but let's say everything functions simultaneously. And that's one of the mysteries of perception, that how all this is being perceived simultaneously. Perceived, accessed, processed, right? And neurophysiologists say that this is due to the fact that it's a very, very complex and rich process. There's all these chemicals and what have you, and all this, like how the cognitive process of how the cognitive response that reaches a particular part of the brain, and how that electrically immediately fires, because it knows, it recognizes that particular experience, and it immediately sends the response back to the body, often followed by issuing a qualitative or particular hormone that is, associated with that particular experience. Let's say when we, like smell our favorite, like, I don't know, a jasmine flower or a rose, or a dinner that is about to come on the table, right? Like smell of a curry, and right, something is happening in the tummy. It's instantaneously that this. It's all to do with the, cognitive responses. But what interests us here is not that in itself. What interests us here is that what and who is really in charge, where the perception itself comes from, where the perception rests. Is there a limit to perception? We are forever limited to the sensory perception? What about those who have extraordinary perceptions, extrasensory perceptions? What about all those psychic perceptions, that people sometimes are gifted from birth or develop them? How does it feel to perceive this world in a state, let's say, when all this has been transcended? This is what we want to talk about today. And there is something, I should say before that, in the domain of spiritual practice, something is known as refinement of perception. What is refinement of perception? Is where the appreciation of the gross expression of awareness known as solid world, object, becomes much, much more transparent. So it's as it were, we are able to perceive the subtler essence of what on the surface is only known as an apple or an orange or that rose that I've mentioned before, or a rock, a mountain, a moon, what have you. Doesn't matter. The refinement of perception is indispensable part of every spiritual unfoldment. And it's a very important one because it literally allows us to perceive the final layers of reality, which prior to that was concealed by the very form of that what we've considered to be reality itself. I will make it a little bit clearer. For instance, when we speak of the body, right? I'll give few examples. What do we call the body? Very often, when we speak of the body, we only consider and we only address that which is the solidity of the flesh, the tissues, right? Something which we kind of like can touch, right? And therefore, we think of it as something which has a specific, it takes a specific space within the greater space, right? But at the same time, many traditions speak of the body in terms of the greater reality. Like this body is enveloped by the electrical body of the breath, which is known as pranic body. And that pranic body in itself is enveloped by another more finer body known as the body of the mind, the layer of the mind. And like in a Russian doll, one within the other. Then from the manomaya and the vinyanomaya, the body of the intellect. And all that is then, in its turn, enveloped into the greater body of the pure bliss, or like in yogic tradition known as Anandamaya kosha. This is not something which is kind of like has to be taken on trust, and like which could sound very, very bizarre and like, or specific to that particular tradition. It is accessible and actually experientially accessible to all of us. Very often when we, like let's say the direct example, let's say you sit and your friend comes or someone comes from the very back, and you feel their presence as soon as they entered your what we commonly know as auric field. It's our energetic field. So before our physical body is touched, we already feel touched, as it were, but on a more subtle level. It's a confirmation that our body doesn't just ends where we can physically locate it. It extends into space, into greater space. Another example is that when we see something, let's say when we see an object, when we see a rose, and let's say that rose has a nicely intense red or pink color, and it has this beautiful aroma. We see it as a physical act, right? And this is where perception stops, ends. But with refinement of perception, we are able to perceive not just this flower as it manifests itself to that very beautiful budding state, but as if we're able to perceive that which gives the very presence of that flower on a very physical level. It's as if we perceive the colorless sap of that flower, which is translucent, transparent, and yet that colorless sap is what gives redness its richness that we perceive then as a red rose. Likewise, that colorless sap is what gives that rose this very intoxicating scent. And with the expansion and with the refinement of perception, or with the expansion of consciousness, the refinement of perception proceeds, unfolds until it becomes celestial perception. What celestial perception is when we perceive even the subtlest of the subtle, when we perceive the very essence of even that energy which gives birth to that particular form. So let's say it's like perceiving that which has not yet manifested and in a state of pure potentiality. I know it's very, very maybe hard to imagine, but deep within, you have that, because all of us have that on the level of the heart. And this is where the very core of what I would like to address today, of what I would like to speak today with you, what I would like to share. So perception is not limited to just gross object or gross objectivity of the world. This is ultimately perception unfolds and unrolls when it completes, as it were, full circle and falls back to where it came in the first place. And because consciousness is self-referral in its essence, we start to perceive our own self everywhere, even through the sensory apertures. What do I mean by that is that wherever I look at someone or at something, all I can see is my own self. It's not that I mistake my identity, no. But when perception reaches its utmost refinement, one fails to perceive the other. One only perceives one's own self. Wherever one's awareness goes. It doesn't matter whether one sees the tree, a bird, another human being, a dolphin, pleasant, unpleasant, joyful, ugly, beautiful, one perceives oneself. This essentially is what is known as seeing from the heart. This is what is known as seeing when seeing from that which is the only one that sees. Because it's not that we see through all this rich, complex network of physiological responses that neurophysiologists are now studying closely, and perhaps will give us some extraordinary dimension on that. But it is the heart that perceives above all else, and heart knows no difference. And it is most explicitly spoken of in the traditions of Sufism and Tantra. But you can find the same very passages in, let's say, early Christianity. You can find that in Taoistic texts. You can find that as it reflects in many other traditions. What does it mean, seeing from the heart?